Now it is time to head to the runway where the glider landed. The runway itself isn't publicly accessible, except on race days. But we can visit the commemorative park that is just nearby, and see there the Gimli Glider's cockpit, which has been lovingly restored by the volunteers at the Gimli Glider Museum. This section of the tour is audio, so you can listen to it while you drive or bike, and you can follow along the route on the app's map. It is often the case when explaining a man-made disaster, be it a nuclear meltdown, a sinking ship, a train crash, or an oil spill, that the blame can't be pointed at a single decision or malfunction. Instead, these events are the result of many small compounding failures and oversights accumulating across a complex system. On their own, each of these minor issues wouldn't be enough to cause disaster. But when enough of them add up, and they come into perfect, malignant alignment, and there is a bit of bad luck, that is when truly horrifying things can occur. The Gimli Glider was one such event, where many small things quietly went wrong for a long time and nobody noticed. And then everything went wrong all at once. However, this was one of those rare occasions when the cascade of bad luck was suddenly headed off by astonishing good fortune and some of the best airmanship the world of commercial aviation has ever known. As you head west, take your mind back to that July afternoon in 1983. You're on the same road the Winnipeg Sports Car Club drove earlier that day. With the fun rally through town behind them, they had driven out to the airstrip for more racing and a celebratory barbecue. Dino Calvert was with the club that day.
My name is Dino Calvert. I was a member of the Gimli Glider ground crew when it landed here at the airport at Gimli. I'm actually a member of the Winnipeg Sports Car Club, and it was a race weekend for us, so we'd been racing all day Saturday. And we finally broke for the day, and I was actually outside firing up a barbecue.
Nobody in Gimli knew it yet, but somewhere in the skies to the east, a disaster was brewing. Flight 143 had left Montreal that morning, carrying 61 passengers and 8 crew. It was traveling to Edmonton with a quick stopover in Ottawa. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, the world's most state-of-the-art commercial airliner. This particular 767, tail number C-GAUN, had entered service just 3 months before. The 767 was the first aircraft in Air Canada's fleet to be part of the nation's changeover to metric from imperial, an issue that was causing heated political controversy across the country, as well as massive headaches for businesses of all kinds. Air Canada was no exception. Aircraft fuel is calculated by weight instead of volume, and so at that moment, Air Canada's flight and ground crews were calculating fuel for the few 767s in kilograms, while continuing to use pounds for all of Air Canada's other planes, which had yet to switch over to the new system. In addition to having to work with both metric and imperial at once, none of the ground or air crews were given formal training or manuals explaining how to work with this new measuring systems. Aside from some vague reference sheets, they were left to figure out how to do all these calculations for themselves. At the same time, since the 767 was a brand new design, dozens of teething issues were still being worked out, especially with the electrical system. One very unfortunate issue was that on the first batches of 767s, the Fuel Quantity Information System, or FQIS, malfunctioned very frequently. This was an ongoing problem for C-GAUN, and it effectively meant that on July 23rd, the plane had no working fuel gauge. A replacement FQIS was waiting in Edmonton to be installed as soon as it landed. The plane would miss that particular maintenance appointment. Captain Bob Pearson had been among the first pilots Air Canada trained for the 767. He loved the aircraft. But during the pre-flight checks in Montreal, he found the fuel gauges were blank. With the gauges dead, the ground crew fell back on manually measuring the fuel with drip sticks. The result they got in liters then needed to be converted to kilograms. The conversion factor they used, however, was for pounds per liter. So, when Captain Pearson took off that day, he was told he had 22,300 kilograms of fuel, when in fact he had 22,300 pounds. Pearson flew the first short leg of the trip to Ottawa and noticed the plane felt light, and he asked the ground crew there to double-check his fuel with dripsticks, just to be safe. Astonishingly, the Ottawa ground crew made the same mistake as the Montreal one. Here's Pearson.
Noticed that there was an imbalance between the wings. I had to bring the refueling truck back. So they did that. Mechanics in Ottawa went through the same drip procedure and gave us the figures in kilogram. We programmed, and it made sense what we programmed because we didn't burn much fuel taking off from the west in Montreal and landing to the west in Ottawa.
After taking off from Ottawa, the flight was going well. They were cruising in smooth, clear skies and slightly ahead of schedule. Then, 41,000 feet over Red Lake, Ontario, a warning buzzer emitted 4 short beeps. At the start of the flight, Captain Pearson had manually input the reported fuel amount in the flight computer, and at that moment it showed 11,800 kilograms of fuel remaining, comfortably above the minimum required. Unfortunately, the flight computer had no idea what was actually in the tanks. This made the rapidly escalating situation all the more baffling for Captain Pearson and his first officer, Maurice Quintal.
So when things started happening just about the Manitoba-Ontario border, first a low-pressure fuel warning light came on, and I made the assumption that it was a failed fuel pump. Then more low-pressure fuel warning lights came on. So this was something we didn't understand. We didn't have any background information on how these systems work. So we made a decision to divert the flight to Winnipeg, made an announcement that, sorry to inconvenience you folks, but we've got a main maintenance base in Winnipeg and diverting the flight to solve the problem. Disconnected the autopilot and just started down, the left engine failed. We shut down the engine and its associated systems. We just done that. The right engine failed. At that point, we were 28,000 feet without engine power, which also eliminated our main hydraulic systems and our main electrical systems.
The outcome looked bleak. At this point, air traffic control in Winnipeg asked how many people were aboard, as they wanted to know how many people were about to die. Then, thankfully, 2 emergency redundancies designed into the 767 did come into play. The first was the ram air turbine, or RAT. It was a little wind turbine that popped out of the bottom of the plane and generated a tiny but crucial amount of power for the hydraulic systems. It allowed the plane to be steered at some minimal level. Think of it like driving a 132-ton flying car without power steering. The second redundancy was the emergency nickel-cadmium battery that powered the most essential instruments, like the airspeed indicator, the radio, and the altimeter. The kind of instruments a World War II pilot would have been familiar with, Pearson would later remark. These systems could theoretically provide just enough for the pilots to land the plane. The rest was up to the cool professionalism of the crew, acting under extraordinary pressure. The loss of power meant the cabin had gone dark, and the PA system no longer worked. Flight attendants had to shout to be heard as they demonstrated emergency landing positions. Passengers were removing sharp objects like glasses, high heels, and jewelry, and were assuming the brace position. Lillian Fournier was on vacation with her sister Pearl. Pearl had never seen the mountains. Lillian turned to her and said, "Pearl, in 5 minutes, we're going to be dead." Then, she later said, she felt unaccountably serene. In Winnipeg, Air Traffic Controller Len Dasco gave them their position, since the transponder was dead. With pen and paper, First Officer Quintal calculated their descent rate of 2,400 to 2,500 feet per minute and charted their course to Winnipeg. He looked up and said, "We're not going to make it. We'll be 12 miles short." Quintal began looking for alternatives. As luck would have it, he was a former Air Force pilot and had previously been based at CFB Gimli back when it was an operating Air Force facility. "We're 45 minutes from Gimli. That's a long runway," he said. Captain Pearson had heard of Gimli, but he had never been there. For years, he had been a glider pilot, glider instructor, and towplane pilot. Landing an unpowered aircraft on a runway was something he knew how to do. It's just nothing like it had ever been done by anyone in anything remotely as heavy as a 767. But it's not like they had a whole lot of options.
First officer had some training in Gimli, so I made the decision to proceed to Gimli, which was 14 miles behind us in our 4 o'clock position. As we approached, flew up the west shoreline of Lake Winnipeg, Morris spotted the airport, pointed it to me, but we were getting quite high. And we were going to be too high to make a straight-in approach. We decided to do something that's not normally done in large aircraft, but is done in smaller single-engine airplanes, and that's called a side slip, where you simply cross the controls so the airplane flies inefficiently. You use the fuselage and the inefficient attitude of the aircraft to create drag, which allows you to increase the rate of descent and slow the aircraft down. So we were a glider. Even in elementary gliders, you have two things. You have a vertical speed indicator and speed brakes. We didn't have either. So it was just a fly-by-night situation and on-the-job training, I guess.
Flying the plane inefficiently is a very professionally understated way of saying he was making the plane fly sideways to cause it to fall out of the sky. It's a maneuver that puts incredible stress on the airframe, is notoriously difficult to control, and can very easily cause enough air to pass over the leading wing that it causes the plane to suddenly flip upside down and plunge to the earth. As they approached Gimli, Quintal feared the leading wing was getting pulled down so far it was just about to hit the ground. They were 40 feet from the ground when Pearson finally released the side slip and righted the plane for landing. Quintal saw people in the middle of the runway. There were cars, barbecues at the end of it, and 3 boys on bicycles who had ridden down the runway and watched in awe as the silent plane approached. When they realized the danger, they started frantically biking in the other direction. Quintal thought, should I tell Pearson about the people? But no, it was too late. At 8:38 in the evening, 29 minutes after the first warning light came on over Red Lake, the wheels of C-GAUN touched down.
The nose gear simply collapsed. Nothing broke. The nose gear collapsed. The nose hit the ground with a bang. It sounded like a couple of double-barrel shotguns going off. And right away, the cockpit started filling with smoke. And we stopped in 3,000 feet, mercifully missing 3 boys on bicycles, which was a heart-stomping experience for me.
The aircraft ground to a stop at the guardrail of the drag strip, nose down, engine nacelle scraping the pavement, smoke billowing forward. In the cabin, after a stunned moment, someone yelled, "Yahoo!" and spontaneous applause broke out. Then, the flight attendants were on their feet, moving. Dino Calvert was outside, and he saw the plane land.
I'm heading there. As I'm running towards it, the doors opened on the airplane, and out came the chutes. And it was just like a spider growing legs. And then all of a sudden, people are coming down them, and they're at the base of these chutes, and they're just standing there. So I started calling to the people saying, "Get away from there. Come over this way. Get the other side of the racetrack." And they sort of slowly started coming, and I sort of passed them because I was going the other way with my hands full of fire extinguishers. A lot of other people had passed me at that time. I got there, and there was a small fire, and we put that fire out.
All 61 passengers came off those slides, some landing on their feet, some tumbling, some catching others. Just 6 weeks earlier, 23 people had died trying to get off a burning Air Canada DC-9 in Cincinnati. Every person on Flight 143 knew about Cincinnati, and they wanted to get off that plane fast. Thankfully, the evacuation was rapid and orderly. Pearson and Quintal finished their emergency checklist in the smoke-filled cockpit and stepped off the forward exit. Now, so close to the ground, they more or less simply walked off onto the pavement. Once Pearson was certain all passengers were clear, he went back aboard, alone, to find fire extinguishers from the flight deck. Gary McGregor was a member of Gimli's volunteer fire department, and when he got the call, he rushed to the scene.
Every incident that we've ever had at the airport has always been a Cessna, Beech 18, DC-3, something like that. But when you see the 767 at the end of the runway, I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do with 600 gallons of water and 10 gallons of foam?
RCMP Sergeant Bob Monroe had been driving the road that runs perpendicular to this runway when his radio crackled. He looked right and watched the aircraft touch down.
I only thought at the time was that, my gosh, I hope this doesn't roll over, well knowing from watching shows about airplanes that crash, they tend to roll and break apart and burn. In this case, it did not happen.
The empty fuel tanks proved an unexpected blessing, since they meant there was little risk of the plane erupting into a ball of flames on the runway. Within a few short minutes, the flight crew, the race club members, and the volunteer firefighters had the situation under control.
15 or 20 minutes later, Selkirk showed up, which was funny. A guy I refereed with from the fire department in Selkirk come running up saying, "Is there a fire?" And I says, "No." I says, "No fire, and we really don't need you guys." He says, "We knew that, but we wanted to come for a drive to see what it was." And that's a typical firefighter. They're all nosy. They all want to see.
Nell Christofferson was attending a high school reunion in the base's old drill hall when someone came running in.
He comes running in, and he's waving his hands, and he's all excited. He says, come on, quick." He says, "You guys, what's the matter?" He says, "An Air Canada jumbo jet just crash landed on the runway." And I thought to myself, this isn't April 1st. This is July the 23rd. Where's this guy coming from?
All 69 people got off the aircraft safely. There were no fatalities. As the passengers gathered on the runway, Dino Calvert heard one of them ask where they were. Someone said Gimli.
I always admire how Bob landed the aircraft. I tease him quite a bit that he did a very bad job of parking the aircraft. If he would have picked the other runway, I think he would have done such a fabulous job. There would have been no damage done to the aircraft whatsoever, except for maybe a flat tire or two.
Afterwards, the aircraft sat nose down on this runway for a few days as Boeing engineers investigated it and Air Canada mechanics patched it. The damage was surprisingly slight.
The only damage there was on the starboard side, where the flat tires, and on the nose compartment, because the nose gear collapsed.
When the plane was deemed airworthy again, C-GAUN taxied to the north end of this runway and took off, heading south. Dan Sigmundson was there to watch it take off.
It went off fairly quickly, and it seemed to take off in a much shorter distance than I had anticipated. And then I headed south with a gear down position, and I disappeared into the distance.
The Gimli Glider, as it became internationally known, flew for Air Canada for another 25 years. In 2008, it was retired to the aircraft boneyard at Mojave, California.